My 36-year-old supervisor groomed me since I was 17 and secretly declined my full-ride scholarship to keep me at his company, so I asked for an open relationship. That was 2 years ago. He still texts, "Happy birthday," from burner phones. While working from a WeWork after losing his 15-year career to 7 women's testimonies. First off, I need to say our age difference isn't the problem here. My boyfriend has been the most amazing part of my grown-up life because he's older, not even though he is. For the 5 years we've been dating, I've changed and grown so much as a person, mostly because of his kind love and huge amount of help and grown-up way of thinking that helped me figure out how to be an adult. None of my friends in long-term relationships have anything like what my boyfriend and I have, and they all say they wish they did. Also, he's more attractive and in better shape than all their boyfriends. So if your first reaction to this situation is that some dirty old man is taking advantage of a young, naive girl, then you're wrong. Anyways, he is an administrative supervisor at my company. He trained me my first 2 weeks on the job when I first got hired, and we hit it off immediately because we have a lot of things in common. Nothing happened then, but I just couldn't stop thinking about him. So after about a month, I stopped by his office after work and asked him out for coffee. 6 months later, I moved in with him. That first year was the best time I've ever had in a relationship. We traveled, ate out, went to shows and movies. He taught me so much about life. He would really engage with me and listen to what I had to say. He also wasn't afraid to ask me those really tough questions that made me look at situations from another perspective. He taught me how to stand up for myself and conflict resolution. The more time we spent together, the more I love him. Then COVID happened. My boyfriend is not perfect. One major problem is he is a micromanager when it comes to work and a workaholic. As soon as lockdown started, he started working nonstop. Sometimes he would work 14 to 16 hours a day. From the end of April to the second week in June, he worked 36 days straight. He would come home, kiss me, work out, shower, and go to bed, just to get up the next morning and do it all over again. No one asks him to work like that, he just does. He says, "I have to be an advocate for our team and make sure they're in good hands." Due to his work ethic, I got really lonely during this time. I talked to him about it, and he cut back some of his work. He even started doing silly things like ordering cheesy decorations online, then decorating our dining room like a Chinese restaurant and ordering takeout from our favorite Chinese place so it would feel like we went out. It was fun and nice, but I was still lonely. Around this time, an old friend from high school contacted me through Facebook. We started talking first on iMessage, then we started texting. He was really there for me and showed me a lot of attention. After a while, he asked if I wanted to meet up for drinks. I said yes, since my boyfriend wasn't home. I ended up drinking more than I usually do. Before I knew it, we were kissing. I'm not going to lie, it felt really good. I did allow it to go too far, but I only gave him brain and no SX was had. I left and went home. I felt awful, not because I did it, but because I did it behind my boyfriend's back. The next day, I asked my boyfriend if we could talk. I started out by telling him how lonely I've felt for these past few months and how I wanted to ask his thoughts on an open relationship. He was actually really receptive. He sat down with me and asked several questions about our relationship and how strong did I think it was. He listened as I explained that I loved him, but needed attention that he can't provide right now. I wanted him, but I didn't feel like my needs were being met, and this would be an easy and safe way for me to get that attention I've been missing. He asked what brought this on, and I explained about my friend and how I wasn't interested in a relationship with him, but I would like to go out with him just for some distraction from everything going on. I then also took the time to inform him that this would be an one-sided open relationship. I was not comfortable sharing him with any other woman. However, I explained to him how this is completely different with me. I don't work nearly as much as he does, I am alone a lot more, and need the connection from someone else way more than he does. Since he works all the time, he has no time to even look for partners. After I said all of this, he sat there for several minutes, and that's when I saw the hurt and pain in his eyes. It wasn't till that moment I realized how selfish I had been. It was like someone poured ice water over me. I had not once thought about him in this entire situation, but before I could say a word, he said, "You need to leave." I tried to talk more, but he said he was not in a place emotionally to communicate with me effectively, and that I needed to give him space. I just broke down crying. I had messed it all up and hadn't even realized it till that moment. He left after that and asked me to leave before he got back. About 2 hours later, I got a text from him saying that we need some time apart, and he didn't feel like we needed to be in a relationship right now. That was 2 days ago. I'm staying at my parents' house now, completely devastated and unable to function normally. I've been going through every text message we ever sent, looking for signs of where I went wrong. My mom keeps bringing me tea that goes cold while I stare at my phone. She knocked on my door this morning and found me on the floor surrounded by printed screenshots of our conversations from the past 5 years. I'd highlighted every sweet thing Derek ever said to me in pink, and every time he mentioned work in yellow. The yellow sections took up most of the pages. My dad walked in while I was taping them to my bedroom wall in chronological order. He stood there watching me arrange 5 years of messages like some detective trying to solve a case. When I turned around, his face had this expression I couldn't read. He picked up one of the papers from 2019 where Derek was explaining why I shouldn't apply for that study abroad program. "You're too important to the team here," Derek had written. "Besides, those programs are overrated. Everything you need to learn, I can teach you better." I snatched the paper back and told my dad he wouldn't understand. He sat on my bed and asked me to explain it to him. So I started from the beginning, how Derek saw potential in me when I was just a scared 17-year-old intern who didn't even know how to use the copy machine properly. My dad's jaw tightened when I mentioned 17, but I kept going. I told him about all the times Derek stayed late to help me with projects, how he never made me feel stupid for asking questions, how he bought me my first business suit because he said I deserved to look as professional as I was becoming. My phone buzzed with a text from my manager asking why I hadn't logged into the system yet. That's when I realized Derek must must have already talked to HR because my remote access wasn't working. I tried calling the office, but the receptionist said I'd been transferred to the warehouse location across town, effective immediately. My hands shook as I hung up. The warehouse was where they sent people they wanted to quit. No windows, no advancement opportunities, just scanning boxes all day. I drove to Derek's apartment without telling my parents. His car was in the parking lot, so I knew he was home. I still had my key, but when I tried to use it, the lock had already been changed. I knocked for 20 minutes, calling his name, explaining through the door that I just needed to get my things. Mrs. Chow from next door opened her door and told me Derek had asked her to call the police if I showed up. She looked at me with pity as she held her phone, waiting to see what I would do. I left before she could make the call. On the drive back, I passed the coffee shop where we had our first date. I pulled over and went inside, ordering the same vanilla latte he'd recommended to me that day. The barista was new, probably around my age. She complimented my necklace, the one Derek gave me for our first anniversary. I touched it reflexively, remembering how he'd fastened it around my neck and said it looked like it belonged there. When I got home, my mom was in my room taking down all the text messages I'd taped to the walls. She had them in a neat pile on my desk. I screamed at her to leave them alone, that she didn't understand what Derek and I had. She turned around with tears in her eyes and said, "Madison, we need to talk about Derek." She sat me down and pulled out her own phone, showing me text messages between her and my dad from 3 years ago. They were discussing whether they should intervene in my relationship. My dad had written, "She's 19 and he's 38. This isn't right." My mom had responded, "But every time we try to bring it up, she has an explanation, and he's so polite when he comes over. Maybe we're overreacting." I felt betrayed that they'd been talking about my relationship behind my back. My mom scrolled to more recent messages where they discussed how I never spent time with anyone my own age anymore, how I'd stopped mentioning my college friends, how every story I told somehow involved Derek. There was one from last month where my dad wrote, "I'm scared we're losing her." My mom put her phone away and held my hands. She told me about a conversation she'd had with Derek at my birthday dinner last year. She'd casually mentioned that my high school friend Sarah had reached out, wanting to reconnect with me. Derek had taken her aside later and explained that Sarah was a toxic influence who had always been jealous of me, and that it would be better if I didn't know she'd called. My mom admitted she'd believed him because he seemed so concerned for my well-being. I pulled my hands away. Sarah had been my best friend since middle school. I couldn't believe she'd tried to reach out and no one told me. I grabbed my phone to look her up on social media, but I'd blocked her on everything. I couldn't even remember why. Something about her not understanding my relationship with Derek, being jealous, saying things that weren't true. The words felt like Derek's words in my mouth. My laptop was still at Derek's apartment with most of my clothes, my jewelry, my work files, everything that mattered. I texted him asking when I could pick up my things. He responded within minutes with a formal message saying I could coordinate with building management to retrieve my belongings during business hours and that he would not be present. He'd already packed everything and left it with the doorman. I drove back to his building feeling numb. The doorman, Robert, who'd always been so friendly, barely looked at me as he helped load 3 boxes and 2 suitcases into my car. 5 years of my life fit into the trunk of my Honda Civic. When I opened the first box at home, I found all my photos carefully wrapped, my clothes neatly folded, my toiletries in labeled bags. Even in kicking me out, Derek had to show how organized and thoughtful he was. At the bottom of one box, I found the notebook where I used to write down all the advice Derek gave me. I flipped through pages of his wisdom. "Your friends don't understand our connection because they're still children. Your parents mean well, but they don't see how mature you've become. You don't need other people when you have me." My handwriting looked so young and eager, little hearts dotting the I's. Tyler texted me that evening, asking if I was okay. He'd heard through mutual friends that Derek and I had broken up. I stared at his message for an hour before responding. Derek had always said Tyler was immature, still stuck in high school mentality, not someone I should waste time on. But Tyler was the first person my age to reach out to me in months. We met at a Starbucks the next day. Tyler looked exactly the same as in high school, just with better clothes and a real job now. He told me he'd actually tried to message me on Instagram last year for my birthday, but I'd never responded. I checked my message requests and found dozens of unread messages from old friends, former classmates, people I'd once been close to. I'd never seen them because Derek had set up my social media accounts to filter messages from anyone he hadn't approved. Tyler mentioned that Sarah worked at the marketing firm just 2 blocks from my office. She'd apparently asked about me whenever she ran into mutual friends, always hoping I was doing well despite how our friendship ended. I couldn't remember how it ended. The memory felt foggy, like looking through frosted glass. Something about her not supporting my relationship, being jealous of my happiness, trying to poison me against Derek. But the words felt scripted, rehearsed. I asked Tyler why he'd reached out now. He looked uncomfortable and said he'd actually seen me at the grocery store last month with Derek. He said I'd looked right through him like he wasn't there, and Derek had steered me away by the elbow when Tyler tried to wave. He said I looked different, older but not in a good way, like someone had dimmed my light. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about all the filtered messages, all the friends who'd tried to stay in touch. I made a list of everyone I'd lost contact with since dating Derek. The list filled 3 pages. Next to each name, I tried to remember why we'd stopped talking. The reasons all sounded the same. They were jealous, they were immature, they didn't understand real love, they were toxic influences. Derek's words, not mine. My first day at the warehouse was humiliating. My new supervisor, Linda, was kind but clearly confused about why someone with my experience was transferred there. She mentioned that this was the 3rd young woman from the main office to be transferred to the warehouse in the past 5 years. Strange coincidence, she said, but her eyes suggested she didn't think it was a coincidence at all. During my lunch break, I sat in my car and finally unblocked Sarah on Facebook. Her profile picture showed her laughing at someone's wedding, surrounded by people our age. She looked happy and normal and young in a way I'd forgotten I could be. I spent 20 minutes typing and deleting a message to her. How do you apologize for disappearing from someone's life when you can't even remember why you left? I finally sent Sarah a simple message. Hi, I know it's been years. I'm sorry. My finger hovered over the send button for another 5 minutes before I pressed it. The message showed as read almost immediately, and 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Madison, is this really you? Sarah's response came through. I typed back that yes, it was me, and I understood if she didn't want to talk. Her next message made my chest tight. I've been waiting for this message for 4 years. Can we meet? We agreed to meet at a park near her office the next day during lunch. I spent the morning at the warehouse, mindlessly scanning packages while Linda trained me on the inventory system. She kept giving me these knowing looks, like she understood exactly why I was there. During our break, she casually mentioned that the other 2 women who'd been transferred here had both been in relationships with supervisors from the main office. One had filed a complaint that mysteriously disappeared, the other had just quietly left after 6 months. Sarah was already at the park when I arrived, sitting on a bench near the fountain where we used to eat lunch during high school. She stood when she saw me, and we both just stared at each other for a moment. She looked exactly like herself, just more polished, more confident. Professional blazer, nice shoes, the kind of put-together look that came from actually building a career instead of being someone's secret. We hugged awkwardly, and she pulled back to study my face. Her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or recognition. She suggested we walk while we talked, and I agreed, grateful for something to do with my nervous energy. Sarah didn't waste time with small talk. She asked me directly what had happened with Derek. I started to give her the rehearsed version, the one where we just grew apart, where the age difference finally caught up to us. She stopped walking and turned to face me. Madison, I know that's not true. I know because Derek called me 2 years ago. My stomach dropped. Sarah continued, explaining that Derek had called her out of the blue, saying he was concerned about me. He'd told her I was going through a difficult time, that I'd become paranoid and jealous, that I was making up stories about people trying to break us up. He'd asked her, as someone who used to care about me, to please not reach out if I contacted her because it would only fuel my delusions. I sank onto a nearby bench, my legs suddenly unable to hold me up. Sarah sat beside me and pulled out her phone, showing me the call log from 2 years ago. 3 calls from a number I recognized as Derek's office line. She'd screenshot them because something about the calls had felt wrong to her. Sarah told me she'd tried to reach out anyway, through my mom, through social media, even through Tyler, but every avenue had been blocked. My mom had been convinced by Derek that Sarah was a bad influence. My social media had me blocked. Tyler had been warned to stay away. She'd even tried to accidentally run into me at places she knew I went, but I was never alone. Derek was always there, always steering me away before she could approach. I asked her why she'd kept trying, why she'd cared so much when I'd clearly cut her off. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She told me about her cousin who'd been in a similar relationship, how the isolation had happened so gradually that no one noticed until it was almost too late. She said she'd recognized the pattern with me, the way I'd slowly disappeared from everyone's life except Derek's. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Building management informed me you retrieved your belongings. I trust you found everything in order. Please remember that our workplace has strict policies about maintaining professional boundaries. I hope you'll respect those moving forward. I showed Sarah the message. She read it twice, her jaw tightening. She asked if I'd kept any of our old conversations, anything that showed what our friendship had been like before Derek. I admitted I'd deleted everything from before I met him. It had seemed like the mature thing to do at the time, leaving my childish past behind. Sarah pulled up old photos on her phone from high school, from college visits, from the summer before I'd started my internship. In every photo, I was surrounded by friends, laughing, making silly faces, looking young and carefree. She showed me one from my 18th birthday party, just a month before I'd started working at Derek's company. I looked like a completely different person. We talked for 2 hours. Sarah filled in gaps in my memory, reminding me of plans we'd had, dreams I'd shared with her that I'd completely forgotten. She told me about the graduate program I'd been accepted to, but had turned down because Derek had convinced me it was a waste of time. I had no memory of even applying. As I walked back to my car, I felt hollow. Everything I thought I knew about the past 5 years was shifting, like looking at an optical illusion and suddenly seeing the hidden image. I drove back to the warehouse in a daze, barely registering the traffic around me. Linda was waiting for me when I returned, holding a manila folder. She asked if we could talk privately and led me to a small break room. Once the door was closed, she opened the folder and spread out several documents. They were transfer forms, all for young women, all from Derek's department, all sent to the warehouse. The dates spanned 8 years. She pointed to one name, Chow. The name seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. Linda explained that Catherine had been Derek's mentee before me. She'd been 19 when she'd started, fresh out of high school, eager to learn. She'd lasted 3 years before requesting a transfer to another city, but before she'd left, she'd come to Linda, trying to file a complaint. The complaint had disappeared, but Linda had kept her own copies. I read through Catherine's statement, my hands shaking. The patterns were identical. The initial mentorship, the special attention, the gradual isolation from peers, the relationship that started when she turned 21, the way he'd convinced her that everyone else was jealous or trying to sabotage her success. The only difference was that Catherine had tried to leave earlier, and Derek had made her work life unbearable until she'd had no choice but to quit. Linda told me Catherine wasn't the first. There had been at least 2 others before her, though Linda hadn't been in a position to document those. She'd been watching Derek's pattern for years, keeping records, waiting for someone to be willing to come forward. She asked if I'd be willing to file a formal complaint. I thought about Derek's text, his warning about professional boundaries. I thought about how he'd already positioned me as the unstable ex-girlfriend, the one who'd cheated, who'd demanded an open relationship. relationship. Who would believe me over him? He'd been at the company for 15 years. He had spotless performance reviews. He was respected, admired even. That night, I finally told my parents everything. Not the rehearsed version, but the real story. How Derek had pursued me when I was 17. How he'd waited until I was 18 to make it official. How he'd systematically removed every other influence from my life. My mom cried. My dad paced the living room, his hands clenched into fists. They told me things I hadn't known. How Derek had called them separately, building trust with each of them. How he'd convinced my mom that my dad was too overprotective, that he didn't understand modern relationships. How he'd told my dad that my mom was naive, that she didn't see the dangers I might face without proper guidance. He'd played them against each other so skillfully that they'd stopped discussing their concerns about him together. My dad pulled out his laptop and showed me emails Derek had sent him over the years. Professional, thoughtful emails about my progress at work, my development, my potential. In every email, Derek positioned himself as the stable, mature influence I needed. Reading them now, I could see the manipulation, the way he'd presented himself as the solution to problems he'd created. I spent the next morning calling the numbers Linda had given me. 2 of the women didn't answer. 1 had disconnected her number, but Chow picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was cautious when I introduced myself, but when I mentioned Derek's name, she went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. We met that afternoon at a restaurant in the next town over. Catherine looked successful, put together, normal. She was a marketing director now at a different company. Married, she mentioned, to someone her own age. She twisted her wedding ring as she talked, a nervous habit that seemed at odds with her confident appearance. Catherine's story was eerily similar to mine, but with details that made my skin crawl. Derek had convinced her to move in with him after 6 months. He'd helped her decorate, picking out furniture that he said was more sophisticated than what she would have chosen. He'd replaced her wardrobe, saying her clothes were too young for the professional image she needed to project. He'd even convinced her to dye her hair, saying her natural color washed her out under office lights. She showed me photos from that time. In them, she looks like a completely different person. Older, yes, but also somehow diminished. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. She was always dressed impeccably, but in clothes that looked like they belonged on someone else. She looked like she was playing a role, and badly. Catherine told me about the breaking point. She'd run into a professor from her community college who'd mentioned a scholarship she'd won but never claimed. She had no memory of winning any scholarship. When she'd investigated, she'd discovered that Derek had been intercepting her mail, her emails, making decisions for her that she never knew about. The scholarship would have paid for her to finish her bachelor's degree at a 4-year university. Derek had declined it on her behalf. When she'd confronted him, he'd had an explanation for everything. The university was too far away. The program wasn't as good as the mentorship he was providing. She didn't need a degree when she had him to guide her career. But something had finally clicked for Catherine. She'd seen him clearly for the first time, and the image had terrified her. Her exit had been messy. Derek had made her work life miserable, assigning her impossible tasks, writing her up for minor infractions, documenting every mistake. He'd told their colleagues that she was unstable, that the stress of the job was too much for her. By the time she'd left, everyone believed she'd had some kind of breakdown. It had taken her 2 years to rebuild her career, 3 years to trust anyone again, 4 years before she could talk about it without shaking. She'd thought about reaching out to warn whoever came after her, but Derek had made it clear that any contact would be considered harassment. He'd kept that threat hanging over her even after she'd left. I told Catherine about Linda's documentation, about the possibility of finally holding Derek accountable. Catherine gripped her coffee cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. She said she'd think about it, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Derek had taken years from her, but she'd rebuilt. Coming forward meant risking everything she'd worked to create. As I drove home, my phone rang. Derek's name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, but he called again immediately, and again. On the 4th call, I answered, my heart pounding. His voice was calm, controlled, the same tone he'd used when he'd taught me how to handle difficult customers. He said he'd heard I'd been spreading lies about him at work, trying to damage his reputation. He reminded me that defamation was a serious legal matter. He had resources, he said, lawyers who specialized in protecting people from false accusations. I tried to speak, but he continued over me. He knew I was hurt, he said. He understood that rejection could make people do desperate things, but he was concerned about me, about what this behavior said about my mental state. He'd already documented my instability, my inappropriate asexual behavior with Tyler, my demands for an open relationship. If I continued down this path, he'd have no choice but to protect himself. The threat was clear, even through his veneer of concern. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone. It immediately started ringing again. Derek's name flashed on the screen over and over. I turned it off and threw it in my glove compartment. When I got home, there were flowers on our doorstep, expensive roses, the kind Derek used to buy for special occasions. The card read, I'm worried about you. Please don't make me take action. D. My mom found me sitting on the porch steps, staring at them. She read the card and immediately called my dad. Within an hour, they'd installed a security camera and changed the locks, even though Derek had never had a key to their house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Catherine's words, about how long it had taken her to rebuild, about the other women Linda had mentioned, the ones who'd simply disappeared rather than fight, about how Derek was already 3 steps ahead, already painting me as the unstable ex who couldn't handle rejection. I pulled out the notebook with Derek's advice again, reading through it with new eyes. Every piece of wisdom was about isolation, control, dependence. You don't need friends when you have a partner who truly understands you. Family means well, but they can't see your potential like I can. Other people will try to poison what we have because they're jealous. Page after page of manipulation disguised as mentorship. My laptop dinged with an email notification. It was from Derek's personal account, sent to my work email. The subject line read, "Concern for your well-being." I opened it to find a lengthy message detailing his worries about my mental health, complete with dates and times of my erratic behavior. He'd CC'd HR, my new supervisor Linda, and several other department heads. The email was a masterpiece of manipulation. Every sentence dripped with false concern while painting me as unstable and potentially dangerous. He mentioned my sexual acting out with Tyler, my delusional accusations, my harassment of his neighbors. He even expressed worry that I might harm myself or others if I didn't get help. At the bottom, he'd attached what he called documentation of concern, screenshots of text messages taken out of context, photos that seemed to show me in distress, even a video clip of me crying in my car outside his building. I realized he must have been recording me for months, maybe years, building a case for exactly this moment. I forwarded everything to Linda with shaking hands. Within minutes, she called me. Her voice was grim but not surprised. She told me to come to her office first thing in the morning and to bring any documentation I had. She also told me to consider getting a lawyer. The next morning, I arrived at the warehouse to find Derek's car in the parking lot. My stomach lurched. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his department, wasn't his building. But there he was, standing by the entrance in his perfectly pressed suit, looking every inch the concerned supervisor. He approached me before I could change direction. His voice was soft, meant only for me. He said he was worried, that my behavior was escalating, that he only wanted to help. He reached for my arm, and I jerked away. That's when I noticed Linda watching from the doorway, her phone in her hand, recording. Derek noticed her too. His demeanor shifted instantly, becoming more professional, more distant. He said he was just checking on an employee who seemed to be struggling. He hoped I would get the help I needed. Then he walked to his car, every movement calculated to project calm authority. Linda ushered me inside quickly. In her office, she showed me her phone. She'd captured the entire interaction, including the moment he'd reached for me and I'd pulled away. It wasn't much, but it was something. She'd also been busy. She'd found contact information for one of the other women, someone named Catherine who'd left 7 years ago. I spent the morning documenting everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, the gradual changes in my life. Linda sat with me, asking careful questions, helping me see patterns I'd missed. She showed me Derek's employee file, the commendations, the glowing reviews, but hidden between the lines were gaps, transfers, departures that didn't quite make sense. By lunch, I was exhausted. My phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. When I finally checked, they were from colleagues at the main office. Derek's email had done its job. People were concerned about me, but not in the way I'd hoped. They thought I was having a breakdown, that I needed help. Tyler texted, asking if I was okay. He'd heard rumors that I was stalking Derek, that I'd been harassing him since our breakup. Even Tyler, who'd seen Derek's controlling behavior firsthand, was starting to doubt what was real. Derek's narrative was taking hold, spreading through the company like poison. I sat in my car during lunch, wondering if Catherine had been right to disappear. Fighting Derek meant fighting not just him, but the entire image he'd cultivated over 15 years. It meant being labeled as crazy, unstable, vindictive. It meant risking my career, my reputation, everything. But then I thought about the next girl, because there would be a next girl. There always was. Some bright young intern with potential, eager to learn, grateful for attention. Derek would see her, target her, shape her into what he wanted, and the cycle would continue. I made my decision. I drove to a lawyer's office that Linda had recommended, one who specialized in workplace harassment. The consultation was free, but the retainer would wipe out most of my savings. Derek had always handled our finances, insisting it was easier that way. I'd never questioned why he wanted me financially dependent. The lawyer, a woman named Catherine, listened to my story without judgment. She'd seen this before, she said. Older men in positions of power, using mentorship as a hunting ground, the gradual isolation, the financial control, the documentation of instability when the relationship ended. It was textbook, she said, which made it both easier and harder to fight. She explained my options: filing a formal complaint with the EEOC, pursuing a civil case, getting a restraining order. Each path had risks, costs, challenges. Derek had been smart, careful. He'd stayed just within the bounds of legality while systematically destroying my autonomy. But patterns mattered, she said. Other victims mattered. Documentation mattered. I signed the retainer agreement with a hand that barely shook. Catherine told me to document everything from now on. Every contact, every threat, every instance of retaliation. She also told me to be prepared. Derek would escalate. Men like him always did when they felt their control slipping. I drove back to the warehouse to find my access card deactivated. The security guard looked embarrassed as he explained that there had been a safety concern, and I would need to wait for Linda. I sat in the lobby, watching through the glass doors as my coworkers went about their day, unaware of the battle I was about to fight. Linda emerged after 20 minutes, her face grim. HR had received another email from Derek, this one suggesting that I might be a danger to myself or others. He'd recommended administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation. Linda had pushed back, but Derek had allies, people who trusted his judgment, who saw him as the stable veteran employee concerned about a troubled young woman. Linda handed me a temporary badge and walked me through the security doors. Her office was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork. She closed the door behind us and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Catherine finally agreed to talk, she said, sliding a phone number across the desk. She's scared, but she's willing to share her documentation. She kept everything. I stared at the number, my hands trembling. Linda continued pulling out papers, emails, performance reviews, transfer requests. Each document painted the same picture. Young women, always between 17 and 20 when they started, always transferred or terminated within 3 to 5 years. My phone buzzed. Another email from Derek, this time to my personal account. The subject line read, "Final warning. I didn't open it. Instead, I called Catherine and read her the subject line. She told me to forward it unopened, to let her handle all communication from now on. That afternoon, I met Catherine at a diner 40 minutes outside town. She was older than Catherine, maybe early 30s, with nervous hands that kept rearranging her silverware. She'd brought a laptop bag stuffed with printed emails, recorded conversations, even security footage she'd somehow obtained before leaving the company. Catherine's story started like all the others, 17, eager, grateful for Derek's mentorship, but she'd been smarter than the rest of us. She'd started documenting everything from the beginning, sensing something off about his attention. She showed me emails where Derek had declined a full scholarship to State University on her behalf, telling the admissions office she'd decided to focus on her career instead. I never even knew I'd been accepted, she said, sliding the rejection letter across the table. He intercepted my mail for 2 years. I only found out because my high school counselor called my parents' house to congratulate me. She'd confronted Derek, and he'd convinced her the university was trying to poach talented employees, that they didn't really want her for her potential but to fill diversity quotas. She'd believed him. We'd all believed him. Catherine had saved everything. Screenshots of Derek telling her which friends to block. Recordings of him explaining why her family didn't understand their connection. Even a video she'd secretly taken of him going through her phone while she pretended to sleep, deleting contacts and messages. The worst part, she said, gripping her coffee mug, is that I thought I was special. I thought I was the only one. When I found out about Catherine, I felt sick. When I heard about you, I knew I had to do something. She slid a USB drive across the table. Everything was on there, she said. 7 years of evidence. Enough to establish a pattern that even Derek's lawyers couldn't explain away. I drove back to the warehouse in a daze, the USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. Linda was waiting in the parking lot, her face pale. She grabbed my arm before I could get out of the car. Don't go inside, she said. Derek's here with HR. They're conducting interviews about your threatening behavior. He's got 3 employees ready to testify that you've been stalking him. My stomach dropped. Linda continued. But here's the thing. I've been doing some digging. Those 3 employees, they're all women who've worked closely with Derek, all young when they started, all promoted quickly, all completely dependent on him for their careers. She handed me a printout of their personnel files. The patterns were there if you looked. Rapid promotions followed by lateral moves, glowing reviews from Derek, mediocre ones from everyone else, the same trajectory I'd been on until last week. We sat in my car for an hour while Linda made calls. She'd reached out to a contact at the EEOC. With Catherine's evidence and Catherine's willingness to provide a statement, we had enough to file a formal complaint. But Derek was moving faster, building his case that I was unstable and dangerous. My dad called while we were strategizing. Derek had shown up at their house with a police officer, claiming I'd been harassing him and he feared for his safety. The officer had been apologetic, but had to follow up on the complaint. My dad had shown him the security footage of Derek leaving the flowers, and suddenly the officer's demeanor had changed. He wants to talk to you, my dad said. The officer. He said this isn't the first time Derek's name has come up in stalking complaints, but the complaints always seem to disappear. I met Officer Martinez at the police station that evening. He was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and a careful way of speaking. He couldn't share details of other cases, he said, but he could tell me that establishing a pattern of behavior was important. Document everything, file reports, create a paper trail that couldn't disappear. He also suggested I file for a restraining order immediately. The flowers, the emails, showing up at my workplace. It was enough to establish a pattern of unwanted contact. It wouldn't stop Derek from his professional retaliation, but it would create legal consequences if he continued to contact me directly. The next morning, I sat in a courthouse waiting room with Catherine, filling out paperwork for a temporary restraining order. My hands shook as I wrote out the timeline of events. 5 years condensed into black ink on legal forms. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, read through my application carefully. She asked pointed questions about the relationship, the age when it started, the power dynamics at play. When she granted the temporary order, she looked at me over her glasses. Young lady, she said quietly, I see cases like this more often than you'd think. You're brave for coming forward. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I left the courthouse with a copy of the order and instructions for the full hearing in 2 weeks. Catherine warned me that Derek would likely contest it, that he'd bring his lawyers and his documentation of my instability. But now we had Catherine's evidence. We had Catherine's statement. We had Linda's documentation. We had a pattern that spanned almost a decade. That afternoon, Linda called with news. HR had placed Derek on administrative leave pending an investigation. It wasn't a victory. He was still being paid, still had his benefits, but it was a start. The young women he'd lined up to testify against me had suddenly become reluctant to get involved once Derek wasn't there to pressure them. Sarah came over that night with Thai food and a bottle of wine. We sat on my childhood bedroom floor, eating pad Thai and looking through old photos she'd saved on her phone. Pictures of us at 18, carefree and silly. Pictures from my 19th birthday, the last one I'd celebrated with friends my own age. Pictures from the summer before I'd met Derek, when I'd had plans and dreams that didn't revolve around him. I kept trying to save you, Sarah said, tears in her eyes. I watched you disappear, and I couldn't do anything about it. I squeezed her hand. She had tried. They'd all tried. I just hadn't been able to see it. The next few days blurred together. Meetings with Catherine, statements to the EEOC investigator, phone calls with other women who'd worked with Derek, some willing to talk, others too scared. Each conversation revealed new pieces of the pattern. The young interns who'd suddenly quit, the promising employees who'd transferred to other departments, the ones who'd left the company entirely. Catherine finally agreed to meet with the investigator. She flew in from Seattle, where she'd rebuilt her life. We sat together in Catherine's office as she told her story to the official record. Her hands shook the entire time, but her voice was steady. He told me I was special, she said, that I was different from other other girls my age, that he saw potential in me that no one else could see. I believed him because I was 17 and didn't know any better. The investigator, a middle-aged woman named Ms. Rodriguez, took careful notes. She'd seen this before, she told us. Men in power who prey on young women, using mentorship as a hunting ground. The patterns were always the same: the isolation, the control, the careful documentation of instability when the relationship ended. Derek's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter that afternoon. I was to stop spreading malicious lies or face legal action. Catherine laughed when she read it. "This is desperation," she said. "He knows the walls are closing in." That evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a young woman named Jessica. She was 19, an intern in Derek's department. He'd been mentoring her for the past 3 months. "I heard what's happening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been so nice to me, staying late to help with projects, buying me coffee, telling me I'm too talented for the internship program. Is it true, what they're saying about him?" I told her the truth, all of it. The grooming, the isolation, the control, the way he'd systematically removed every other influence from my life until he was all I had. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "He asked me to dinner next week," she finally said, "to discuss my career trajectory." I was so excited. I thought I was special. We talked for an hour. I gave her Linda's number, Catherine's number, the EEOC investigator's number. I told her she wasn't alone, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that Derek was the predator here. When we hung up, I felt something shift inside me. This was why I was fighting, not just for justice for myself, but to stop the cycle. The full restraining order hearing arrived faster than expected. Derek showed up with 2 lawyers and a briefcase full of documentation. I had Catherine, my parents, and a growing stack of evidence that painted a very different picture than the one Derek was trying to sell. He took the stand first, every inch the concerned ex-boyfriend. He spoke about my mental health struggles, my inappropriate sexual behavior, my obsessive tendencies. He presented text messages out of context, emails carefully edited, photos that seemed to support his narrative. But then Catherine cross-examined him. She asked about Chow, about Catherine, about the other young women who'd mysteriously left his department. She presented the full text conversations, the complete emails, the pattern of behavior that spanned years. Derek's calm facade cracked slightly. He insisted these were all misunderstandings, that he'd only ever tried to help these young women succeed. But when Catherine presented Catherine's video of him going through her phone, deleting contacts, his lawyers objected frantically. The judge overruled them. The video played on the courtroom screen. Derek's face was clearly visible as he methodically deleted messages, blocked contacts, changed settings on a phone that wasn't his. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Catherine's sleeping breaths in the recording. When it was my turn to testify, I told the truth. All of it. How he'd pursued me when I was 17. How he'd waited until I was 18 to make it official. How he'd convinced me that everyone else was jealous, immature, trying to sabotage us. How I'd believed him because I was young and he was everything I thought I wanted to be. The judge granted the permanent restraining order. Derek was ordered to stay 500 feet away from me, to cease all contact, to stop spreading false information about my mental health. It was just paper, but it felt like armor. Outside the courthouse, Derek's lawyers huddled with him, their faces grim. One of them approached Catherine and handed her an envelope. Derek was offering a settlement, he said. A substantial sum in exchange for dropping the EEOC complaint and signing a non-disclosure agreement. Catherine didn't even open it. "No," she said simply. "My client isn't interested in being silenced." The EEOC investigation intensified over the next weeks. More women came forward, not just from our company, but from Derek's previous job. The pattern went back 15 years. Always young women, always interns or entry-level employees, always the same tactics. The company launched its own investigation. Linda was promoted to lead it, given full access to personnel files and email records. What she found was damning. Derek had been flagged by HR multiple times over the years, but the complaints had always been buried. He had allies in high places, people who'd benefited from his ability to develop young talent. Jessica, the intern who'd called me, filed her own complaint. She'd recorded Derek suggesting they discuss her career over dinner at his apartment. When she'd declined, he'd become cold, critical of her work. She'd documented everything, learning from our mistakes. 3 weeks after the restraining order hearing, Derek was terminated, not quietly transferred or allowed to resign, terminated for cause. The company sent out a carefully worded email about their commitment to a safe workplace. They implemented new policies about supervisor-subordinate relationships. They brought in consultants to conduct training. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo the damage, but it was something. I started therapy with someone who specialized in coercive control. The first session, I could barely speak. The second, I cried for the full hour. By the third, I was beginning to understand how thoroughly Derek had rewired my thinking. "It's not your fault," my therapist repeated. "You were 17. He was 36. The power imbalance was insurmountable." Slowly, I began to rebuild. I applied for jobs at companies where Derek had no connections. I reached out to old friends, apologizing for disappearing, explaining what had happened. Most were understanding. Some were angry that I'd chosen him over them. I couldn't blame them. Tyler and I went to coffee regularly, but just as friends. I wasn't ready for anything more. Might not be for a long time. He understood. He'd started dating someone age-appropriate, someone who wasn't carrying the weight of a 5-year manipulation. Sarah and I resumed our friendship like no time had passed. She introduced me to her friend group, people my own age who did normal 20-something things, game nights, happy hours, weekend trips that weren't orchestrated by someone else. The warehouse job turned out to be a blessing. Linda advocated for me to be transferred to a different department at my original pay rate. I worked in marketing now, using skills I didn't even know I had. My new supervisor was a woman in her 50s who took no no nonsense, and made sure I was included in projects that would build my resume. Catherine and Catherine stayed in touch. We formed a support group of sorts, meeting virtually once a month to check in. More women joined over time. Some were Derek's victims. Others had their own Dereks. We shared resources, validated each other's experiences, celebrated small victories. The legal battles continued. Derek sued for defamation. We countersued. The EEOC found cause to believe discrimination had occurred. The company settled out of court, admitting no wrongdoing but paying damages to 7 women. Derek's portion was garnished to pay his mounting legal fees. 6 months after leaving Derek, I enrolled in community college. Just 2 classes to start, paid for with part of the settlement money: business management and psychology. I sat in classrooms with people my age and younger, feeling ancient and naive at the same time. My professor for the psychology class was a woman who'd left corporate life to teach. After class one day, she pulled me aside. She'd recognized something in my essays, she said. The careful way I wrote about power dynamics, about manipulation, about control. I've been where you are, she said simply. It gets better, but it takes time. I moved out of my parents' house into a small apartment with Sarah. We decorated it with thrift store finds and plants that I somehow managed to keep alive. I cooked meals that Derek would have said were too simple. I wore clothes he would have called unprofessional. I made choices without asking anyone's permission. The restraining order expired after a year. Derek had violated it twice, both times earning him arrests and fines. He'd lost his professional reputation, his LinkedIn now a ghost town of removed connections. Last I heard, he was working as a consultant, struggling to find clients who hadn't heard about the scandal. But I knew he'd find new victims eventually. Men like Derek always did. They just got better at hiding it. I graduated from community college with a 4.0 GPA. My parents cried at the ceremony. Sarah cheered embarrassingly loud when I walked across the stage. Linda sent a congratulations card with a job offer inside, a junior management position at a company she'd moved to. I took the job. My new office had a window. My colleagues were diverse in age and experience. My supervisor was professional and boundaried. No one offered to mentor me over private dinners. No one suggested I was too special for normal career development. On my 25th birthday, I celebrated with 15 friends at a karaoke bar. We sang badly and laughed loudly and acted our age. I thought about the birthdays I'd spent with Derek, quiet dinners where he'd chosen the restaurant, ordered for me, reminded me how lucky I was to have someone who understood me so well. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me open it. Happy birthday, Madison. I hope you found peace. No signature, but I knew who it was from. I blocked the number and went back to singing. My friends were waiting, and I had a life to live. A real one this time. One I'd chosen for myself. The next morning, I filed a police report about the contact. Officer Martinez took my statement, adding it to Derek's file. The pattern continued, he noted. Even after everything, Derek couldn't resist trying to maintain some thread of control. But I was done being controlled. I had a career, friends, a life that belonged to me. The scars were still there, might always be there, but they no longer defined me. I was 25 years old, and I was finally free.